Good news, good life. Do you believe in God? Which one? Believers or non-believers? All of humanity cannot deny knowing the attribute of God. Although today there are some differing opinions on the idea of His possible existence, at least everyone recognizes what is meant when the word God is mentioned. In this recording, however, we will focus on the human experience of His relationship with God. When it comes to describing the personality of God, it is easy to confer to Him the attributes of omniscience, omnipresence, omnipotence, infinity, eternity, goodness par excellence, love, all-powerful, sovereignty, mercy. All these attributes refer to an entity that is different from and superior to the human being, as it can be described, namely mortal, incomplete, weak, limited, at the mercy of emotional states such as fear, shame, anger, excitement, anxiety, regret, pride, and there is develop attitudes such as arrogance, distrust, apathy, impatience, inferiority or superiority complex, as well as undertake actions based on the desire to control, dominate, shine, survive, be validated by others, amass and maintain possessions, relationships, image or positions. If we were to consider the description mentioned above, we could easily conclude that man is the opposite of God. This idea is clearly not rejected in the daily life of man, since he constantly says that God is not a man to lie or fail, or quite simply, I am only human, so I can be wrong. While we all agree on the fact that man is made in the image and likeness of God, there's it comes to wonder, at what level should we consider said likeness? If we want to find light on this concern, it is important to consider some of the paradoxes in which human beings live on a daily basis. First, we must understand the nature of human. We all know that he is made of a physical body that distinguishes him from the rest of creation and allows others to identify him. But beyond this body, he has a mind that is a sort of invisible space from which the physical body draws all of its commands, a bit like a kind of software. We find there a system of thoughts that circulate constantly, a system for processing these thoughts, as well as a backup system. The set of activities, expressions, and attitude that will govern man, and that he will call his life, will come from these systems. But beyond these systems, which I can describe as basic, I will mention two other actors that seem to dispute the identity or the personality of man. These are the ego on the one hand and the conscience on the other. These two concepts have been somehow trivialized in the current use of humans. So we have ended up neglecting their importance as well as their impact in his life, and especially in his relationship with God. When we mention ego, we often imply a tendency to consider only self-advantages, or quite simply, we refer to one's pride as man or woman. And when we mention conscience, we are either referring to the sense of judgment between good and evil, or simply referring to cognition, which is the state in which we are aware of ourselves and what exists in our reality. Here, I will approach the ego as a system found in the cognitive consciousness of a human, which allows him to distinguish himself from the rest of creation in order to facilitate his experiences in matter. Its main missions are to protect humans against the danger of death or destruction, whether on a physical, mental, emotional, or social level. Its other mission is to ensure that he flourishes in the material world by having as much control as possible over his life and everything related to it. The conscience can be considered as the observer behind all the physical, mental, and emotional activities that constitute the experience of life in the matter. It can be attributed to two main roles. The first one is being at the basis of the creation of reality from the infinite and inaccessible part of the human mind, which we will call unconscious or subconscious. This is where our reality is born before it flows toward the material dimension that we can conceive and perceive. The other role is that of observing the result of the manifestation of reality thanks to the cognitive part. Now that we have a little idea about our nature and constitution, of course considering only the essential that can be useful to us in our topic, let us return to the relationship with God. The paradox we spoke about above relates to the conception of God and the relationship with Him from the ego compared to those from the conscience. Although distinct from each other, the ego and the conscience all have access to our cognition, which explains why it is difficult for us to distinguish their activations or experiences. However, it is important to know that our conscience knows the whole truth beyond what our cognition can conceive or perceive, while the ego, by its nature and function, can only receive or react to what is. It produces nothing and has no access to the source of life. So, in our conception of God, the conscience allows us to recognize the attribute of God, since it is directly and permanently connected to Him, while the ego can only attribute characteristics to Him based on what is available in terms of information or experiences, and from there define the relationship that seems logical and acceptable. It has just been said that the conscience is permanently connected to God. To better understand what this might mean, let us try to revisit our concept of God. For me, God is the source of all that is. I prefer not to use the term creator because, according to me, to create means to make something distinct from oneself, using something external to oneself in a specific time. That is to say, with a beginning and an end. Talking about source implies that the thing is an expression or emanation of its origin in a particular state or form, while retaining the nature and property of the source. Instead of saying that God created the universe and everything that temporarily evolves in it, I would say that God chose to express Himself as life through different forms and in different dimensions. Said life unfolds in the form of an eternal dance, letting forms be born and others depart in perfect harmony. And beyond just experiencing being this life, God will eventually spread Himself as a conscience in fragments within different forms in order to experience singularity, temporality, and relativity. It is among these fragments that I will classify the human being. Each of us is therefore a fragment of divine conscience connected to the source and consequently to everything else, but can only experience life from his point of observation. This is why human conscience has neither beginning nor end, and how it is in the image and likeness of God, who is his source and co-creator with him of the reality they are supposed to experience there together. So, if this is the reality of which humans are supposed to be conscious, how can we explain the difference in their relationship with themselves and with God in their daily lives? We cannot hide from the fact that humans' relationship with himself and with God is based on the characteristic attributed to him above. In his daily life, human says he is under the control of a God distinct from him, invisible and inaccessible, supposed to live and reign in the sky, ensuring that he remains the only master. For this, he would have established a list of rules and obligations to observe in order to be in his good graces, deserve his interventions, and escape his punishment. Man has the feeling of being abandoned to himself, and he is convinced that without his conscious intervention through reason, culture, and effort, nothing can happen in his life. But given the danger that lie in wait for him and the needs to which he is supposed to provide answers on a daily basis to ensure possible reinforcement, he will put in place strategies for connecting with God, including prayer as a means of communication, chapels and temples as points of contact, worship program and pious activities as safeguard to maintain the relationship solid and lasting. And in this relationship, man will have the same attitude as when he is in the presence of his fellow men. That is to say, feeling guilty for his fault. Imagine imagining that God is angry, yet conscious of his attribute of mercy. He will try to flatter his pride through fine words, boasting of his greatness, his power, and his incomparable and infallible side. However, he is well aware that God is not endowed with an ego and that he is not the type to react on emotional basis or in search of external validation. Worse still, he will almost always come to him with a list of information to provide him and mission to entrust to him. However, aware that he is omniscient and sovereign, and above all, he shares in real time all his experience and that he intervenes in it, I would say 99% in the entire process of creating reality. In the end, he will tend to evaluate him on the basis of the way in which he has proven himself in the satisfaction of his desires or in acting according to his expectations. In my opinion, the explanation for all this is the paradox within man. When his cognition is more inclined toward his ego, the only reality, truth, or life experience resides at the level of what he conceives and perceives. And thus, his life is directed on this basis. For his relationship with God to be in accordance with his conception from the conscience, he simply needs to begin a conscious or cognitive process to disconnect from the ego and its version of the reality to turn toward his conscience and embrace its truth about the reality. We can still ask the question, if the ego cannot know God, given his nature and functions, where does it draw the data that allows it to regulate the relationship with the latter? In my opinion, as it said in the Bible, faith comes from what we hear. But in this case, I would rather say that belief is born from the information that the brain stores. Stories about man and his relationship with the divine has been passed down from generation to generation. Unfortunately, this transmission must not have been as faithful as we might hope or imagine. Oral transmission is often questioned, but even writing transmission must have experienced influences and upheavals throughout history. Today, different sacred books, depending on their religions, are recognized as being sources of information or knowledge par excellence about God. I would say that they contain information on how man has evolved in his relationship with God. But today we go so far as to consider that through these books we acquire knowledge of God. By combining all the stories, their versions, as well as the transmission routes, I personally attribute the responsibility for the origin of humanity's current belief about the relationship with God to the different stories going back a long time where humanity would have become acquainted with alien beings to whom it would have attributed the characteristic that the ego tends to attribute to God today. That is to say, imposing by his greatness and his power to the point of reigning as a tyrant, capricious as to the favors that we ask of him, susceptible and ready to judge and condemn the least of our acts, Lord of the armies who takes side in favor of certain people to fight others. This following what human would have observed in these entities of being or beings. There would have been at the base of several creations, among which we count the evolved version of the human, distinguishing him from the other animals, making him more like themselves physically, moving from multiplicity of gods according to their responsibilities and expertise, to the taking of power by a single God declared unique, all-powerful and creator. Humanity would move from polytheism to monotheism. Although many are not aware of these stories or consider them as simple myths in ancient civilizations, the whole of religious life today, as well as the spiritual domain, which we tend to consider as an aspect of life alongside the social, economic, health, or security, is not only similar. I would even go so far as to say that it will be a simple continuity of these ancient beliefs and practices, just like the sovereign and slave relationship that could be observed there. Some names even come back today, like the Elohim, with Yahweh established as the unique and sovereign God of humans. This is my personal analysis, which is not meant to influence any belief nor be the basis for it. The idea here is to help us understand where the ego would draw from to condition our lives, and how these impact our entire life experience in matter. We can reconsider our beliefs, reject some to turn to new ones. It could not change much. Let's just know that we have a belief in God based on what history has transmitted to us. But our conscience remains aware of our source, of which we are one of the expressions. It is that awareness of being and of our nature that shakes us a little inside when we hear that we would be subject to divinities that are not God, creating a reflex or rejection of this possibility as being a truth concerning us. Our conscience is aware of the true God who is our source, but as long as our relationship with Him will be based on beliefs, it will be difficult to be sure that it is the same God, because according to me, our mental capacity is limited to what exists, and God is not subject to existence. In other words, God does not exist. He is. His essence is the source of existence. Therefore, the ego cannot conceive of him or perceive him. Only the conscience knows him. Therefore, we cannot understand him, but we will always be aware of him. And this only when we become conscious of ourselves as fragments of him, who is infinite conscious, expressed as life, manifested as energy through forms and dimensions, while remaining constant in eternity. Now, looking at your relationship with yourself and with God, which God do you think you believe in? A character straight out of mythology, or simply being convinced that life is based on your control? You ended up creating a God in the image of your ego, the only one to whom you can entrust control, while convincing yourself that is God. So you went from a being in the image of God to the creator of a God in your own image. Since your belief can only offer you these kind of options, the question will be then, do you believe in God? Or you are consciously living your experience within the divine? So, how do we move from belief of the ego to awareness of the conscience? Join us in the next recording on the same channel. Good news, good life.